The January wind whipped across Silicon Valley's pristine streets as Sarah Mitchell strode into Quantum Dynamics headquarters, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. At 34, she'd built her cybersecurity empire from scratch, turning a garage startup into a billion-dollar corporation. Her dark hair was pulled back in her signature sleek ponytail, pearl earrings catching the morning light, a gift from her grandmother that had become her lucky charm through every major business deal. That morning, like any other, she had no idea her life was about to change forever. The board meeting droned on about quarterly projections until Harrison Way, her CFO, mentioned their newest client, Reeves International Banking. Their representative will be here at 2 to finalize the contract, Harrison said, sliding the portfolio across the table. Sarah barely glanced up from her tablet, nodding absently. She'd secured hundreds of high-profile clients before. This was just another Tuesday. But when James Reeves walked into her office that afternoon, the world shifted on its axis. He wasn't what she expected, not the typical stuffed suit banker with a superiority complex. James stood 6'2" with salt and pepper hair that somehow made him look distinguished rather than old at 45. His charcoal suit was impeccably tailored, but it was his eyes that caught her attention, steel gray with flecks of gold, crinkling at the corners when he smiled. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "Your reputation precedes you. Though I must say, the articles didn't mention your eyes could stop traffic." The comment should have been sleazy, but somehow he made it sound genuine, almost innocent. Sarah felt herself blushing for the first time since college. "Mr. Reeves, welcome to Quantum Dynamics. Shall we discuss your security needs?" That meeting ran 2 hours over schedule. They talked about everything from quantum encryption to their shared love of vintage wines. When James asked her to dinner to continue their professional discussion, Sarah surprised herself by accepting. One dinner turned into weekly dates. James was unlike anyone she'd ever met, brilliant yet humble, successful but not arrogant. He listened when she spoke about her parents' sacrifices to put her through MIT, about losing them both in a car accident just before her company took off. He shared his own stories of climbing the banking ladder, of his dreams to revolutionize financial technology. Her executive team noticed the change in her. "You're practically glowing," her assistant Miranda commented one morning. "This Reeves guy must be something special." Sarah was too caught up in the whirlwind to notice the small inconsistencies. Like how James never invited her to his home, always meeting at high-end restaurants or her penthouse. Or how he smoothly deflected questions about his family, offering vague answers about a complicated relationship with his parents. When he proposed 3 months later at the French Laundry, going down on one knee with a 5-carat diamond that caught every eye in the restaurant, Sarah didn't hesitate. "Yes," she exclaimed, tears streaming down her face as the entire restaurant erupted in applause. The wedding planning became a media sensation. Silicon Valley's cybersecurity queen marrying into old banking money, it was a match made in corporate heaven. Every detail was meticulously arranged, the exclusive venue in the Swiss Alps, the custom Vera Wang gown, the 300-person guest list of tech moguls and financial elite. Harrison tried to warn her once, coming into her office late one evening. "Sarah, have you run a background check on James?" he asked carefully. "Something about the Reeves International Banking numbers seems off." Sarah dismissed his concerns with a wave. "Harrison, I know you're looking out for me, but I've never been happier. James is perfect. Besides, their bank has been around for generations." The wedding was a fairy tale come to life. Snow-capped peaks provided a majestic backdrop as Sarah walked down the aisle, her grandmother's restored lace veil trailing behind her. James looked at her with such adoration it brought tears to her eyes. During their first dance, he whispered, "You've made me the happiest man alive." Later that night, Sarah overheard a conversation that should have set off alarm bells. Two guests she didn't recognize were talking in hushed tones on the terrace. Poor girl has no idea, one murmured. James always did have expensive taste. When she approached, they quickly dispersed, leaving her with an uneasy feeling that she pushed aside. The morning after the wedding, as they prepared for their honeymoon trek through the Alps, Sarah's grandmother pulled her aside. "Darling, remember what I always told you, trust your instincts. They'll never steer you wrong." She pressed a small package into Sarah's hands. "Open it when you need it most." Sarah tucked the package into her hiking bag, hugging her grandmother tight. "Everything's perfect, Gran. James is everything I've ever wanted." As their private helicopter lifted off, carrying them toward their first honeymoon destination, Sarah caught a glimpse of James's reflection in the window. For a split second, his expression was completely foreign, calculating, cold. But when he turned to her, his warm smile was back in place. "Ready for an adventure, Mrs. Reeves?" he asked, squeezing her hand. Sarah squeezed back, pushing down the tiny voice in her head that whispered something wasn't quite right. She was living a fairy tale, after all. And fairy tales always had happy endings, didn't they? The helicopter banked toward the first luxury lodge, and Sarah settled back, unaware that her story was about to become a very different kind of tale, one of survival, betrayal, and the kind of strength she never knew she possessed. As they flew between the majestic peaks, she was still Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had it all. In less than 48 hours, that woman would cease to exist, replaced by someone far more dangerous, a prey who learned to become a predator. But for now, she smiled at her new husband, blissfully unaware that she had just married her would-be murderer, and that the same instinct she'd ignored would soon become her only hope for survival. The real story was about to begin, written not in wedding vows, but in the ancient ice and stone of mountains that had seen countless tales of betrayal play out before. The Gestad Palace Hotel's presidential suite offered breathtaking views of the Swiss Alps, but Sarah barely noticed them as she scrolled through her encrypted emails. Something about the latest bank transfer from Reeves International had caught her attention, a discrepancy in the routing numbers that shouldn't exist. The morning sun cast long shadows across the antique desk where she sat in her silk robe, her untouched champagne breakfast growing warm. "Darling, it's our honeymoon," James called from the balcony, his voice carrying a hint of irritation. "Surely quantum dynamics can survive without you for a few days?" He stepped inside, already dressed in premium hiking gear that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Sarah minimized her laptop screen, forcing a smile. "Just checking one thing. Harrison sent me a strange message about." She stopped as James's hands settled on her shoulders, his thumbs working into the knots of tension she hadn't realized were there. "Always working," he murmured, but there was something off in his tone, a tightness that hadn't been there during their courtship. "The helicopter will be here in an hour for our private glacier tour. Why don't you get ready?" As Sarah dressed in her own expensive hiking gear, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the banking discrepancy. Last night, she'd woken to find James's side of the bed empty. Through the suite's thick doors, she'd heard him speaking in harsh whispers in what sounded like Russian, a language he'd never mentioned knowing. The hotel's helipad offered a panoramic view of the surrounding peaks, their ancient faces scarred by centuries of avalanches and storms. The pilot, a weathered local named Klaus, greeted them with professional courtesy, though Sarah noticed he seemed to avoid making eye contact with James. "The weather is perfect for Glacier Point," Klaus said, helping them board. "But we must return before afternoon storms arrive." He gave Sarah a long look that seemed to carry some unspoken warning. The flight was spectacular, sweeping through valleys where sunlight painted the snow in shades of pink and gold. But Sarah's attention kept drifting to James, who spent most of the journey typing rapidly on his phone, his jaw clenched. Once, she caught a glimpse of his screen, rows of numbers and what looked like offshore account details before he quickly locked the display. They landed on a small plateau near Glacier Point, the helicopter's rotors stirring up clouds of powdery snow. 2 hours, Klaus reminded them, glancing at his watch. The weather can change quickly here. As they hiked away from the landing zone, Sarah reached into her pack for her water bottle and felt her grandmother's package. She still hadn't opened it. James led the way along a narrow trail that hugged the mountain's face, his pace aggressive despite the thin air at this altitude. "James," Sarah called, slightly breathless, "maybe we should stay closer to the helicopter?" These conditions seem challenging for amateur hikers. He turned back, and for a moment, his expression was unrecognizable, a mask of cold calculation that sent a chill through her colder than the mountain air. Then his familiar warm smile returned. "Trust me, darling. The view from the point is worth it. It's why I specifically chose this tour." They reached a stunning viewpoint where the glacier stretched out below them like a frozen river. James insisted on taking photos, positioning Sarah near the edge. As she posed, her satellite phone buzzed in her pocket. Pulling it out, she saw Harrison's name flashing urgently. "Sorry, I should take this," she said, stepping back from the edge. Harrison wouldn't call unless it was crucial. James's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with bruising force. "No service up here," he said smoothly, taking the phone. Before she could protest, he hurled it into the abyss. The device tumbled through the thin air, disappearing into the whiteness below. "What are you doing?" Sarah gasped, stumbling backward. That phone had sensitive company data. About as sensitive as the evidence of my wire transfers. James's voice had changed completely, any trace of warmth vanishing like breath in the frozen air. "Your CFO is troublingly persistent. He's been asking questions about Reeves International's accounts across Europe. Questions that could cause problems for certain, interested parties." Sarah's mind raced, pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The vague background, the rushed wedding, the deflected questions about family and finances. "There is no Reeves International banking, is there?" she whispered. James's laugh was like breaking ice. "Oh, it exists. Just not in the way you think. It's amazing what you can accomplish with the right shell companies and a few corrupt officials. Your company's security contracts gave us access to some very interesting financial networks." He took a step toward her, and Sarah retreated until her heel met empty air. "Your grandmother was right about one thing, you should have trusted your instincts." "The other women," Sarah said, remembering the whispered conversation at the wedding. "There were others before me, weren't there? Smart girl. Always were. Too smart, really." He glanced at his watch. "Unfortunately, tragic honeymoon accidents do happen in these treacherous mountains. Your body probably won't be found until spring thaw, if ever. The insurance payout alone will be worth millions, not to mention your controlling share of quantum dynamics." Sarah's hand crept into her pocket, fingers closing around her grandmother's package. As James took another step forward, she tore it open. Inside was a small canister, military-grade pepper spray with a note wrapped around it, "Trust your instincts, but always be prepared." But before she could raise it, James lunged. Sarah felt herself falling backward, the world tilting sickeningly. The last thing she saw was his face, watching with clinical detachment as she plummeted into the void. The wind rushed past her ears, carrying away her scream as the glacier rushed up to meet her. The impact knocked the air from her lungs, the world exploding into white agony as she tumbled down the icy slope. When she finally came to rest in a deep crevasse, every breath was torture. Above, she heard James's voice carrying down to where she lay broken but alive. "Klaus, thank God you're here. There's been a terrible accident, my wife," she slipped. Through the haze of pain and growing cold, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She forced her breathing to slow, her body to go completely still. She had survived the fall. Now she had to survive her husband. As voices and helicopter rotors echoed off the ice above, Sarah Mitchell played dead, her grandmother's last gift still clutched in her frozen fingers, a reminder that sometimes survival meant waiting for the right moment to strike back. Time became fluid in the crevasse, marked only by the gradual dimming of light filtering through the ice above. Sarah lay motionless, each shallow breath sending daggers of pain through her ribs. The voices above had faded, replaced by the deep groaning of the glacier, an ancient, living thing that had now become both her prison and shelter. Her mind, trained through years of crisis management, catalogued her injuries with clinical precision. 3, possibly 4 broken ribs. Left ankle definitely broken. Multiple lacerations, though the cold had slowed the bleeding. The expensive thermal gear James had insisted she wear, probably intended to preserve her body for eventual discovery, now served as her lifeline against hypothermia. A crack echoed through the ice, and Sarah forced herself to remain perfectly still as loose. Snow cascaded around her. Above, boots crunched on the glacier's surface. James's voice drifted down, now speaking rapid Russian to someone on a satellite phone. Her years of international business dealings had given her enough knowledge of the language to understand fragments, body unretrievable, insurance claim, transfer the assets. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same man who'd mocked her constant work ethic hadn't known about her month-long business trip to Moscow 3 years ago, where she'd picked up enough Russian to understand his betrayal. She fought the urge to laugh, knowing it would both give her away and potentially puncture a lung. Hours passed. The rescue team James had called made several attempts to reach her location, but the unstable ice and approaching storm forced them to retreat. She heard the helicopter pilot, Klaus, arguing vehemently in German about the deteriorating conditions. James's performance as the devastated husband was Oscar-worthy, his sobs echoing off the ice walls. But Sarah had learned to hear the hollowness behind his words. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. Sarah's tech-oriented mind transformed her survival into a series of executable protocols. Protocol 1, preserve body heat. She carefully, silently shifted deeper into a narrow ice cave formed by her impact. Protocol 2, prevent tissue damage. Every 15 minutes, she forced herself to wiggle her fingers and toes, fighting against the creeping numbness. The wind howled above, and in its voice, she heard her grandmother's wisdom from years ago: survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about staying yourself. Sarah had been 12 when her grandmother told her this, after Sarah had survived a vicious bullying incident at school by pretending to be sick for weeks. Sometimes playing weak is the strongest move you can make. In the growing darkness, Sarah's mind raced through the past months, reconstructing James's elaborate con through new eyes. The seemingly chance meeting at her office, now obviously orchestrated. His perfect understanding of her wishes and desires, careful study of her public profile and business interviews. The rushed wedding, designed to prevent too much scrutiny of his background. She thought of Harrison, her faithful CFO, trying to warn her. The numbers he'd noticed. Sarah's analytical mind began piecing together the larger scheme. James wasn't working alone. The Russian conversations, the banking irregularities, this was bigger than a simple insurance scam. Quantum dynamic security contracts gave access to some of the world's largest financial networks. She had inadvertently handed the keys to a cybercriminal empire to a man who had perfected the art of murder by marriage. A new sound cut through her thoughts, the distinctive whir of a drone. They were using thermal imaging to search for her body. Sarah blessed the thick layer of ice above her and the extreme cold that had lowered her body temperature. To their cameras, she would appear as cold as the glacier itself. The darkness became complete, but Sarah didn't sleep. She entered a state of heightened awareness, her senses adapting to her icy prison. She began to read the glacier's language, the different types of creaks and groans that warned of shifting ice. Through the night, she made minute adjustments to avoid being crushed as the ice moved around her. Her thoughts turned to survival statistics she'd once read about Mount Everest climbers. The ones who died weren't always the most injured, but the ones who gave up hope. Sarah had built her company from nothing, fighting through male-dominated tech spaces, surviving corporate takeover attempts and industry crashes. This glacier would not be her tomb. It would be her chrysalis. Dawn brought new voices, local search and rescue teams. She heard them discussing the impossibility of survival through the night, their tones respectful but resigned. James's voice had grown hoarse from his theatrical grief. "Please," she heard him beg, "you have to find her body. I can't bear not giving her a proper burial." Sarah's lips curved in a bitter smile. The mistake most predators made was assuming their prey was simple. But nature's greatest survivors were the ones who learned to adapt, to play dead until the moment was right to strike. Every painful breath, every hour of darkness, every second of fighting the cold became a deposit in the bank of her revenge. Through the morning, she caught fragments of conversation that helped her build a clearer picture. James was pushing to have her declared dead quickly, unusual, the rescue team thought, for a grieving husband. He had already contacted her company's board about emergency succession protocols. Her fingers twitched toward the pepper spray still miraculously intact in her pocket. Not yet. Timing would be everything. The glacier shifted again, and this time Sarah heard something new, the sound of running water. Somewhere beneath her, meltwater was flowing through the ice. Her survival now had a deadline. Spring's approaching warmth, which James was counting on to hide her body forever, could kill her before she had a chance to expose him. As the second day in the crevasse began, Sarah started counting. She counted her breaths, the hours, the droplets of water that occasionally fell from above. She counted the millions in corporate assets James thought he would control, the years he would serve in prison once she proved what he had done. Most importantly, she counted the mistakes he was making in his haste to claim his prize, mistakes that would become her weapons. The rescue teams above began to withdraw as the threat of avalanche grew. James made a show of having to be dragged away from the search site. In the growing quiet, Sarah allowed herself a single, silent tear, not of despair, but of pure, crystalline rage. She had walked into a trap baited with love and trust, but she would crawl out of this ice cave as something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The glacier groaned around her, a sound like ancient laughter. Sarah smiled in the darkness. James thought he had buried her in this frozen tomb, but he had only succeeded in giving her time to plan, to prepare, to transform her pain into purpose. When she finally emerged, it wouldn't be as the Silicon Valley queen who had fallen for a con man's smile. She would rise as something else entirely, a ghost with vengeance in her veins and a fortune at her fingertips. The light above dimmed again, marking the approach of her second night in the ice. Sarah began to mentally draft her own obituary, not the one that would appear in tomorrow's papers, but the true story she would tell when this was over. It began with a fall but would end with a rise that would shake the foundations of the international banking world. All she had to do was survive, stay still, and wait for the perfect moment to shatter James's carefully constructed plan like the fragile ice that surrounded her. As Emily slowly regained consciousness, she was acutely aware of the searing pain that rippled through her body. Her head throbbed with a dull, unrelenting ache, and her limbs felt as though they were made of lead, completely unresponsive to her commands. The sharp scent of salt from the ocean clung to the air, mixing with the earthy scent of damp moss and rotting wood. Her vision was blurry, her surroundings a haze of muted colors that slowly began to sharpen as her senses returned. The ground beneath her was hard and jagged, the rocky shore she had crashed upon unforgiving. Every breath felt like a struggle, as though the very air was fighting against her chest, pushing her back into unconsciousness. But Emily fought it. She forced herself to stay awake, her mind racing through fragments of her life that she barely understood. Had it really happened? Was she still alive? The last thing she remembered clearly was standing at the edge of the cliff, her heart racing as she lost her balance and felt herself falling, the wind howling in her ears, the world spinning out of control. Had she died in that moment? Or had she somehow managed to survive? And if she had, why was she still lying here, broken and alone? Her mind swirled with confusion, but she knew one thing for certain: she had to survive. Something deep inside her told her that this wasn't the end of her story, that she still had a role to play in the drama that had unfolded so unexpectedly. She had to fight, even if it meant more pain, more struggle, more fear. She had already stared death in the face and found herself alive. That alone gave her a reason to push forward. Emily carefully turned her head, the movement slow and deliberate as she surveyed her surroundings. The world around her was eerily silent, except for the occasional crash of waves against the rocks below. The estate where she had been married, her wedding, her dreams, her life, seemed so far away now, like a distant memory from another life. She could barely even remember the smiles, the laughter, the promises made under the false pretenses of love. Everything felt like a lie now, a carefully constructed facade that had crumbled the moment she had fallen. Daniel. Her new husband. She hadn't seen him after the fall, and that in itself was strange. Had he even realized she was missing? Had he looked over the edge, expecting her body to be scattered on the rocks, lifeless? Did he know she was still alive? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. But Emily wasn't ready to face him. Not yet. The fall had broken her body, but it hadn't broken her spirit. She wasn't ready to expose herself as alive, not when she was unsure of what awaited her back at the estate. If Daniel was the man she thought he was, if the man she had married was truly capable of such cold, calculated behavior, then what would stop him from finishing the job? She had no idea what had driven him to this point, to push her to her death, but she couldn't take any chances. Not now. Her first instinct was to remain still, to play dead. The idea seemed morbid, even absurd, but it was the only option that made sense. If she could fool everyone into thinking she had perished in the fall, perhaps she could escape this nightmare with her life intact. Maybe, just maybe, the authorities would find her body before Daniel had the chance to cover his tracks, and they would investigate. They would discover the truth, and justice would be served. That was the hope, anyway. The pain in her body was unbearable, but she forced herself to endure it. She had to stay motionless. She had to stay hidden, even from the world that had created this twisted reality. She didn't know how long she would be able to hold out, how long she could endure the aching silence of her own body, but she knew she had to try. Time was her enemy now, and every second that passed was one step closer to the moment when her survival would be discovered. It was hours before anyone came. Emily's mind had begun to wander, the quiet isolation of her thoughts beginning to wear on her. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps, a rustling in the distance, the sound of voices rising and falling. A search party, perhaps? Her heart beat faster. She couldn't let them find her yet, not when Daniel might be leading them in the wrong direction, or worse, orchestrating a story to cover his tracks. She needed to make sure she wasn't caught in the middle of his lies. The voices grew louder, but they did not approach her. She remained still, her breaths shallow and controlled, focusing on keeping every muscle in her body frozen. She was so close to the brink of exhaustion, her body aching with every passing moment, but she couldn't let them see her move. She couldn't let them know she was alive, not until she knew what she was dealing with. The searchers had passed her by, their voices growing faint again. Emily let out a slow, silent breath, her muscles tensing as she listened to their fading steps. She couldn't believe how close she had come to being discovered. But she wasn't safe yet. Not by a long shot. The next few days were a blur of pain and desperation. Emily remained hidden, living in the shadows of her own mind as her body healed, inch by painful inch. She knew she couldn't stay in the wilderness forever, but she also knew she couldn't go back to the estate, not with the way things had unfolded. Daniel's betrayal ran deeper than she had ever imagined. She had to get to the bottom of it, to uncover the truth, but that meant she had to leave this desolate place and face the man who had tried to kill her. When she finally stumbled back to the estate, it was under the cover of night. She couldn't risk being seen, not when Daniel was likely already preparing his story, crafting his narrative of what had happened. He had probably already told the authorities that she had fallen, that it was an accident, that he had done everything in his power to save her. But Emily knew the truth. And she was about to expose it. The mansion loomed in the distance, dark and imposing. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears. She didn't know what to expect when she confronted Daniel, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had survived the fall. She had survived Daniel's treachery. Now it was time to survive the truth. As she crept closer to the mansion, she saw the flicker of lights in the windows. The police were there, still investigating, no doubt. The thought of them getting too close to the truth made her blood run cold. She had to act quickly. With a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The grand foyer, once filled with light and laughter, now felt cold and alien. Everything about the mansion felt foreign to her now, like a place that no longer belonged to her. She was no longer the naive bride who had walked through these doors. She was a woman reborn, a survivor with a mission. It didn't take long to find him. Daniel was in his study, poring over papers, as though nothing had happened. He looked up when she entered, his eyes widening with shock. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched out, thick with tension. "I thought you were dead," Daniel finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily didn't flinch. "I'm very much alive, Daniel." The words hit him like a physical blow, and for the first time, Emily saw fear in his eyes. She could see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade, the tremor in his hands as he reached for a glass of whiskey. She wasn't going to let him hide behind his lies any longer. "You tried to kill me," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet rage. "You pushed me off that cliff, Daniel. You thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" Daniel's face drained of color, and he stood up, backing away from her. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered, as though pleading for some kind of understanding. "It was an accident, Emily. You don't understand. I had no choice. The business, it was all falling apart. I needed to secure the future. I thought you—" "No." Emily interrupted, her voice rising. "You didn't need to do any of that. You chose to put me in danger for your own gain. And now you're going to pay for it." The confrontation was only the beginning. Emily was determined to expose Daniel for what he had done, to make him pay for trying to destroy her. But as she stood there, watching the man who had once promised to love her, she realized something profound. It wasn't just Daniel who had betrayed her. It was the life she had built, the life she had chosen to live, that had deceived her all along. The world she had once known was gone, and it was up to her to rebuild it from the ashes of her survival. The truth would come out, no matter the cost. And Emily Dawson would be the one to make sure of it. The days that followed Emily's confrontation with Daniel felt like a blur of chaos and disbelief. The truth she had been holding onto for so long, the truth that Daniel had tried to kill her, to cover up his web of lies with her lifeless body, had finally been laid bare. But even now, as she walked away from the wreckage of her marriage and the mansion that had once symbolized her dreams, Emily knew that the real battle was just beginning. The community around her, the people she had known her entire life, would never look at her the same way again. The scandal would send shockwaves through every circle she had once belonged to, and those who had cheered for her wedding, celebrating the union of two powerful families, would now watch in stunned silence as she faced the consequences of a brutal betrayal. As the weeks passed, Emily found herself overwhelmed by the weight of everything that had happened. She had survived a fall that should have killed her, but in many ways, she felt as though she was falling again, this time, into a world she didn't recognize. The people who had once admired her from afar now whispered about her behind closed doors. The tabloids, always hungry for scandal, had a field day, embellishing every detail of her story to fit their narrative of a tragic yet salacious romance gone horribly wrong. Her name was everywhere, but it felt like a distant echo, a life she no longer belonged to. Daniel, meanwhile, was arrested and charged with attempted murder and fraud, his carefully constructed empire crumbling as the evidence mounted against him. His fortune, which had seemed so endless, began to unravel before his eyes, his assets frozen, his investments falling apart. The truth of his shady dealings, the fraudulent business ventures he had hidden under layers of deceit, was now public knowledge. He had thought he could erase Emily, eliminate her as a part of his carefully curated life, but he had underestimated her will to survive. The police investigation went into full swing. Emily became an unwilling witness, her testimony critical to unraveling the full scope of Daniel's crimes. But as much as she wanted to help bring him to justice, the process was exhausting, emotionally and physically. Every interrogation, every reminder of what had happened, felt like another blow to her fragile sense of self. The pain of the fall still lingered in her bones, and the emotional scars were just as deep. Yet she pushed through, driven by the need to see justice served, not only for herself but for the countless others who might have fallen victim to Daniel's machinations if she hadn't survived to expose the truth. In the midst of the investigation, Emily's parents, once so cold and distant, seemed to finally realize the extent of their role in shaping her life. They had pushed her into a marriage with Daniel, thinking it would secure her future, but they hadn't seen the darkness beneath his polished exterior. Now, they were left grappling with the consequences of their decisions, their once unshakable confidence in their wealth and power faltering. They were no longer the invincible figures they had once been, and Emily's survival had forced them to confront the limits of their influence. They visited her often, offering apologies and assurances, but Emily found herself questioning everything. The facade of the perfect family had cracked, and she no longer knew who they were or what they truly wanted from her. She had spent her entire life seeking their approval, but now she realized that their approval came at the cost of her own happiness and freedom. As the investigation continued, Emily began to withdraw from the world. She no longer attended the gala events and social gatherings that had once been a staple of her life. The thought of facing the people who had once adored her, only to have them now stare at her with pity or suspicion, was too much to bear. She turned inward, reflecting on the choices that had brought her to this point. She questioned why she had allowed herself to become so entangled in a life that felt hollow, why she had believed that wealth and status were the keys to happiness. What had she been running from all those years? And more importantly, who was she now, after everything that had happened? But even as she withdrew from the public eye, she couldn't escape the growing realization that she had been changed by the ordeal in ways she had never anticipated. She had survived the fall, both literally and figuratively, but the emotional toll was immense. She found herself grappling with guilt, not for surviving, but for the way she had chosen to survive. Had she done the right thing by pretending to be dead, by hiding in the shadows, allowing her own life to be overshadowed by the need for revenge? It was a decision she had made in the heat of the moment, one that had ultimately saved her life, but now, in the quiet aftermath, she couldn't help but wonder if it had cost her something deeper, her sense of morality, her belief in the goodness of the world around her. Then, the twist Emily had been dreading arrived. The media caught wind of a new revelation: Daniel had been having an affair. The woman, who had once been a mere footnote in the background of Daniel's life, came forward with her story, claiming that she had been the one he had planned to marry all along. The affair had been the driving force behind his actions, the reason he had wanted Emily out of the picture. His plan had never been just about the money, it had been about creating a new life with the woman he truly loved, a life he thought he could only have if Emily were out of the way. Emily's heart sank as she read the news, the betrayal stinging in ways she hadn't expected. This woman, this stranger, had been the one Daniel had turned to while plotting his darkest betrayal. She had known all along that Emily was just a pawn, a means to an end. It was a gut punch that Emily had not seen coming, and it left her reeling. Yet, in the wake of this new revelation, something shifted in Emily. The anger she had felt toward Daniel, the fury that had driven her to expose his lies, began to morph into something else. It was a slow burn, a quiet understanding that perhaps her greatest victory wasn't in making Daniel pay for his crimes, but in reclaiming her own life. She had been so focused on revenge, on making him suffer for what he had done to her, that she hadn't allowed herself the space to heal. But now, with the affair out in the open, with the world knowing the full extent of Daniel's betrayal, Emily could finally let go of the anger. She didn't need to keep fighting him, didn't need to hold on to the rage that had fueled her survival. She had won. She was free. With Daniel's arrest, the legal proceedings moved forward. The courts were ruthless, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. His criminal empire, built on lies, deceit, and manipulation, crumbled piece by piece. Daniel was convicted of attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy, his wealth stripped away as he faced years behind bars. It was a long, drawn-out process, but in the end, justice was served. But for Emily, the victory was bittersweet. She had exposed Daniel for the man he truly was, but she had also lost something in the process, her innocence. She had seen the darkest side of love, of trust, of marriage. She had learned the painful lesson that wealth and power could never protect her from betrayal, and that sometimes, the greatest strength came from within. As Emily navigated the aftermath of the trial, she realized that her life, though scarred, had been irrevocably changed for the better. She no longer cared about the social circles she had once been part of, the people who had admired her for her beauty and status. What mattered now was her own healing, her own journey toward self-discovery. She took time for herself, away from the chaos and the media frenzy, to reflect on the lessons she had learned and to begin rebuilding a life based on authenticity, not appearances. She began speaking out about her experience, sharing her story with others who had faced betrayal, offering them the courage to reclaim their own lives, just as she had done. In time, Emily found peace. She learned to forgive herself for the choices she had made, for the mistakes she had made in the past. She realized that survival was not just about escaping death, it was about embracing life, no matter how messy or painful it might be. And as she stood on the edge of the cliff once more, looking out over the vast, endless ocean, Emily Dawson knew that she had not only survived the fall, she had transcended it. She had taken back control of her life, and nothing would ever be the same again. The community around her would eventually heal, but Emily's transformation had been far more profound. It was her life now, and she was going to live it on her own terms. As Emily stepped into the sunlight for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a sense of liberation swept over her. The clouds that had hung so heavily in her mind for months finally began to dissipate, replaced by the promise of something new. The old Emily, the one who had been trapped in the gilded cage of wealth and expectation, was gone. The scars of the past, both visible and hidden, had molded her into someone stronger, more resilient. The world, which had once seemed so full of deceit and betrayal, now felt vast and full of possibilities. But as she stood at the crossroads of her life, she knew that her journey was far from over. The battle with Daniel had been a war for her very existence, but now, as she ventured into a world that had shifted beneath her feet, Emily had to face the greatest challenge yet, rebuilding not just her life, but her identity. The news of Daniel's conviction reverberated through the community, shaking it to its core. He had been the town's golden boy, a man whose charm and wealth had made him nearly untouchable. But Emily's survival, and her decision to confront him in the most public and powerful way, had shattered the illusion of perfection. People who had once admired Daniel now spoke of him in hushed tones, the narrative of the charming businessman who had a secret darkness slowly unraveling with every passing day. Yet, as the whispers grew louder, Emily found herself becoming more and more distant from the life she had once known. The mansion, once her sanctuary, now seemed like a haunted place, a reminder of all the lies and deception that had led her to the brink of death. Even though Emily had survived, she was not untouched. The trauma, both physical and emotional, still clung to her like a second skin. The nightmares were the worst. They came uninvited, seizing her in the dead of night, dragging her back to the moment of her fall, the sense of helplessness as she plummeted toward the jagged rocks below. The feeling of being utterly out of control, her fate in the hands of forces far beyond her reach, would never leave her. But even in those darkest hours, when she woke up gasping for breath, she clung to the one thing that had kept her going: survival. She had come so close to losing everything, to being silenced forever. But she had survived. And with survival came the opportunity to reclaim her future. In the months that followed, Emily found herself grappling with questions she had never thought to ask before. Who was she without the wealth, the status, the carefully curated life that Daniel had promised her? What did she truly want from life, now that the facade of perfection had crumbled? The only answer that felt right was freedom. She wanted to be free, not just from Daniel, but from the life that had been imposed upon her. She wanted to create something new, something real, something that wasn't defined by the expectations of others. It was a terrifying prospect, but it was the only one that made sense. Emily's first step toward this new life was to leave the town. The memories of the scandal, of the people who had either turned against her or pitted her, were too much to bear. She had spent so much of her life trying to live up to the expectations of others that she didn't even know who she was anymore. So, she left behind the mansion, the town, the whispers, and set off for a fresh start. The road ahead was uncertain, but Emily knew that it was hers to walk. She settled in a small, quiet coastal town a few hours away. It was far from the lavish estates she had once frequented, far from the circles of influence and wealth that had dominated her life. But there was something about the simplicity of the place that appealed to her. The ocean, vast and unending, called to her in a way she had never expected. The ebb and flow of the tides, the way the waves kissed the shore only to be pulled back again, was a reminder of the impermanence of things. Here, there were no expectations, no eyes watching her every move. It was just her and the world, raw and unfiltered. At first, Emily kept to herself, retreating into the solitude of her new life. She took long walks along the beach, letting the salty air fill her lungs, grounding herself in the present moment. She found comfort in the quiet, in the rhythm of the waves, and in the absence of the pressure that had once surrounded her. Slowly, she began to rebuild, not just her life, but her sense of self. She started writing, pouring her thoughts, her fears, and her dreams into journals. She found solace in the written word, a way to express everything she had kept hidden for so long. It was cathartic, almost therapeutic, to give voice to the emotions that had been bottled up for so long. The writing helped her untangle the knots in her mind, allowed her to process the trauma, the betrayal, and the pain. It became a kind of release, a way to make sense of the chaos. As Emily's days passed in the quiet of her new life, she realized that there was something powerful in this simplicity. The absence of wealth, the lack of social status, had forced her to confront herself in a way she never had before. She no longer had the distractions of her former life to hide behind. In the solitude of the beach, she had no choice but to face the person she had become. And as much as it terrified her, Emily found a strength in herself that she had never known existed. She was not the fragile, naive woman she had once been. She was someone new, someone who had survived not just the fall, but the aftermath of the betrayal, the exposure, and the breaking down of everything she thought she knew about herself. In the months that followed, Emily started reaching out to others. She attended support groups for survivors of trauma, sharing her story and listening to the stories of others. It was humbling, hearing the resilience of others who had been through their own battles. In those groups, she began to realize that her survival was not just about her own strength, but about the collective strength of those who had been through similar experiences. She wasn't alone in her pain, and that realization began to heal the wounds that had been left by Daniel's betrayal. One day, after months of contemplation, Emily made the decision to share her story with the world. Not just as a victim of a failed marriage or an attempted murder, but as a woman who had fought to rebuild her life, to take back control of her future. She started writing a memoir, chronicling her journey from the heights of wealth and privilege to the depths of despair, and finally to the freedom she had found in the quiet of the ocean. The process of writing the book was difficult, dredging up old memories and painful emotions, but it was also empowering. With every word, Emily felt herself reclaiming her voice, reclaiming the power that had been taken from her. The book was published a year after she had moved to the coastal town. It wasn't an instant success, but it resonated with people. Survivors of abuse, betrayal, and trauma reached out to her, thanking her for sharing her story. Some asked for advice, others simply expressed their gratitude for her honesty. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt like she was making a difference. She had turned her pain into something meaningful, something that could help others who were going through their own struggles. As Emily sat on the beach one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she realized just how far she had come. She had survived a fall that had nearly killed her, but it was the journey after the fall that had truly defined her. She had faced the darkest corners of her soul, had confronted the deepest betrayals, and had emerged stronger for it. The scars remained, but they were no longer a source of shame. They were a testament to her strength, her resilience, and her refusal to be broken. The community that had once whispered about her now saw her differently. Emily wasn't just the woman who had survived a near-death experience. She was a symbol of survival, of strength, and of the power of reclaiming one's life. She had taken her story, once filled with pain and tragedy, and turned it into something that could inspire others. Her journey wasn't just about escaping the past, it was about embracing the future, whatever it might bring. As the years passed, Emily continued to live her life on her own terms. She continued writing, speaking at conferences, and advocating for survivors of trauma. She found peace in the simple things, an evening walk along the beach, the laughter of new friends, the satisfaction of knowing that she had done the hardest thing possible, she had learned to live again. But even more than that, Emily had learned to love herself. She had learned that survival wasn't just about fighting to stay alive. It was about embracing life with all its messiness, all its imperfections, and finding joy in the journey. And as the sun set on another day, Emily Dawson knew that she had not only survived the fall. She had soared beyond it.